Welcome to today's webinar, Mandatory Reporting of Suspected Child Abuse and Neglect by NCSL. All lines have been placed on listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Gene Rose. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melinda. Hello, and we thank you for joining us from across the nation today for this special presentation on child abuse reporting. This webinar is sponsored by the National Conference of State Legislatures, the Forum for America's Ideas. This is the second webinar that is part of NCSL University series. We hope you'll join us as we explore other issues and provide professional development opportunities throughout the year. Our topic today is one that all of us wish state legislatures did not have to address. Our preference is that we would live in a world where children are always safe and protected and that laws would not be necessary. The truth is, though, that every day we are exposed to stories about child abuse and abused children. And occasionally a story breaks that has everyone running to the statute to determine if their laws address unimagined situations. That occurred last year when Penn State University found itself in the middle of a firestorm. While the details and legal aspects of the case are at the center of the scandal work their way through the judicial system, it did cause legislators in literally every state to take a closer look at their child abuse reporting statutes, and the media across the country have taken note. In fact, just yesterday, the New York Times printed a story on how volunteer coaches are being viewed a little bit differently now. As the lead paragraph noted, the scandal is, quote, already having an impact on thousands of other coaches, both volunteer and paid, who find themselves facing new scrutiny from parents, sports organizations, and even state legislators. And we'd like to point out the story cites information from NCSL, which we will be sharing in more detail with you today. Again, my name is Gene Rose. I've provided public information and media relations services for the Missouri House of Representatives and most recently for NCSL, and now I'm Executive Vice President for Strategic Communications firm Marmillion & Company. In a moment, I will introduce you to our distinguished panel of experts who will provide the broad overview on this issue, as well as the challenges that state legislatures face in addressing this issue. We'll go over current reporting statutes, federal and state legislation, experiences in two state legislatures, Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and then take your question. You may submit a question at any time during today's webinar. Just simply use the chat box at the bottom right portion of your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can during the 60 minutes that we have together today, so we encourage you to get your questions in early. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our panel of experts. First, meet Kelly Crane, a policy specialist with the Child Welfare Project at NCSL. She came to NCSL after working with the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services and the Illinois Attorney General's Office. She's joined by her colleague in NCSL's Washington, D.C. office, Sherry Steisel. And Sherry is Senior Federal Affairs Counsel and the Senior Director of NCSL's Human Services Committee. She has testified in 48 states on income security and social services, food nutrition, and immigration. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania State Senator Kim Ward had an emergency come up quickly this morning in Harrisburg today, but we are fortunate to have speaking on her behalf Vicki Wilkin, who is counsel to the Senate Aging and Youth Committee, which Senator Ward chairs. Ms. Wilkin also is counsel to Senator Ward and to the Task Force on Child Protection. We're honored to also be joined by West Virginia State Senator Dan Foster, who was born, raised, and educated in Tennessee. A doctor, he had his own private practice until 2002, when he was named full-time physician administrator at Charleston Area Medical Center. The same year, he was elected to the West Virginia House of Delegates. 2 years later, his constituents sent him to the Senate. I know you will all get a lot of value from what our panelists have to share with you today. And again, I know they want this to be as interactive as possible. So again, please share your questions with them. Now let's get started and turn the program over to Kelly Crane. Kelly?
Thank you, Gene. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to provide just a brief overview of what the current reporting statutes are like in the states. All 50 states, including D.C. and Guam, Northern Marine Islands, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, have some form of statutes that identify persons required to report suspected child abuse or neglect. And approximately 48 states designate professions whose members are mandated by law to report child maltreatment. Such professions include individuals who typically have frequent contact with children. It may include such professions as social workers, teachers, physicians, and so on. There's also approximately 18 states require any person to report suspected child abuse or neglect. And mandated reporters are required in most states to make an immediate referral to when they suspect or know about abuse or neglect. And in approximately 9 states, reports of child abuse and neglect are referred to the law enforcement agencies. And nearly every state imposes some degree of penalty, often in the form of a fine or imprisonment, on mandatory reporters who knowingly or willfully fail to make a report when they suspect that a child is being abused or neglected. The 3 states, Maryland, North Carolina, and Wyoming, currently do not have statutes that impose such penalties. And next is what's currently happening in the 2012 legislative session. There is 21 states in the District of Columbia that have pending legislation out there around mandatory reporting, and 9 states that have enacted legislation. Some states have introduced multiple bills. Pennsylvania and Virginia are 2 examples that have a number of bills that are pending out there around mandatory reporting. And some states have introduced comprehensive bills that, for example, Florida has the House Bill 1355 that requires their child welfare department to collect and analyze reports of child abuse occurring on Florida campuses. Indiana has a bill out there that is quite comprehensive as well that has been enacted that requires the Department of Education to develop educational materials, response policies, and reporting procedures to assist schools on reporting child sex abuse. And next is the bills that have been introduced. There's actually been 103 bills that we've tracked that have been introduced in 30 states, including the District of Columbia. They include a variety of statutory provisions, including 58 of the bills that have been introduced include some line that adds the list of mandatory reporters, and 31 of those bills add specifically higher education staff, administrators, or coaches, and 10 of those 58 bills require any person who suspects child abuse or neglect to report. A number of bills, 29 bills, include penalties or strengthen their penalties for mandatory reporters who fail to report. And 15 of the bills include a line of provisions that mandatory reporters must report to law enforcement. 14 bills include some provision around increasing or enhancing or developing training, education, for sex abuse prevention. And 5 bills specifically include a mention about workplace immunity, prohibiting employers from taking retaliatory actions against an employer who makes the child abuse report. And then there's 12 other bills that are around mandatory reporting that don't fall into these different provisions. And next, we are tracking this. At the end, you'll see a link to the website where we're tracking this legislation that you can see in more detail all those bills and their status. And next, I'm going to turn it over to Sherry Steisel, who's going to talk a little bit about the federal legislation that's been introduced in 2012.
Thank you, Kelly. I want to start out by letting all of you on the phone know that when I venture an opinion about some of the bills that Congress has introduced this year, that all of this is based on NCSL policy positions. It takes 3/4 of the states to agree before NCSL has a position, and this fall at our fall forum in Tampa, Florida, NCSL adopted a position as it related to the issue of mandatory reporters, and I'll speak to that in a moment, but I want to say that at the outset that we met together to talk about the incident at Penn State and the implications for state-federal relations. There were 9 bills introduced in the 111th Congress after the incident at Penn State. There are a variety of different approaches among the 9 bills. Almost all require states to have some level of mandatory reporters. Many actually prescribe a specific penalty for failure to report. A few make everyone a mandatory reporter. And finally, almost every bill has a penalty on states who fail to enact whatever requirement is in the legislation. Most of these penalties are loss of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act funds, but a few also target burn JAG money or the Social Services Block Grant. I would put all of these pieces of legislation in the category of message bills, bills designed to both expressed concern about the incident, trying to find some kind of state-federal approach. At the same point, also as marker bills for certain members of Congress to say, I want to be involved in any kind of drafting as we go forward. There was a Senate hearing in December about child abuse that did include mandatory reporting in the Senate Help Committee. Senator Harkin of Iowa and Senator Enzi of Wyoming. Senator Harkin is the chairman and Senator Enzi is the ranking member. Held this hearing, and the issue of preempting state authority was addressed and discussed in that hearing. And one of the things that became clear, particularly in the discussions of Senator Casey from Pennsylvania and other members, is the importance of studying this issue before pursuing a preemption of state authority. As NCSL looks at these bills, we're looking at first, how does it affect existing state law and practice? If we turn to the next slide. Next, does it preempt state law? And if we can, there we go. And third, does it improve federal policy or inform state policy? And finally, are there additional resources or cost shifts to the state? I think one of our biggest concerns looking at many of these approaches, and I'll talk to some of the specific bills, is how does it affect what states are already doing, and that fact that most states are re-examining their mandatory reporting law and trying to decide who should be covered, trying to decide what state practice should be, and also the issue of training mandatory reporters. In most cases, the federal laws do preempt state law in this area, and the issue of improving or informing state policy, there are some issues about whether or not it's appropriate for the federal government to make everyone a mandatory reporter or adding criminal penalties when this is an issue that has mostly resided in state law. And finally, there is the issue of resources or cost shifts to the states. And there has been concern both by state agency officials and state lawmakers about any kind of national approach without looking at issues of training reporters and impact on hotlines and other kinds of state agency impacts. We have been able at the NCSL staff level to brief both members of Congress of both parties, as well as the Congressional Research Service, both to give a sense of the overall picture in states, as Kelly has laid out so well, and also look at what impacts potentially could be. And towards the notion of, in the future, looking at some kind of state-federal partnership or combined approach in this area. I'm going to talk now to a couple of the examples of federal legislation. And in particular, if I look at the NCSL policy, just so you know, we both encourage the federal government to support the states in training mandatory reporters, but oppose the federal preemption in defining who is a mandatory reporter or unfunded federal mandates to combat the tragedy of child abuse and neglect. The first example of federal law, federal bill that has been introduced is a bipartisan bill. This bill has the most support co-sponsors. It is bipartisan with Congresswoman Bass of California and Congressman Schilling of Illinois together, working on a bill that mirrors in part the California law in existence today, requiring adults over the age of 18 to report sexual abuse against a child to law enforcement officials or state child protective services agencies. I'd note it limits the mandatory reporting to only as it relates to sexual abuse. There is a penalty of loss of CAPTA funds, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, if a state is not enforcing state law prescribing criminal penalties. The next bill I'd highlight of the 9 is the Speak Up and Protect Every Abused Child Act, Every Abused Kid Act, S. 1877. And that bill both has penalties related to the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, but also states who do not comply with passing a law and implementing a law requiring mandatory reporting of child abuse or neglect from all adults and immunizing from civil or criminal liability any good faith reporting of such kind from any person, official, institution, or agency. The states who don't implement this within 1 year of enactment forfeit their rights both as it relates to 10% of CAPTA, but also have to return funds related to the Byrne JAG Fund, or the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant Program. So that one would be pretty sizable penalty on the state. Some others that I would highlight as well would be a bill introduced by Senator Menendez of New Jersey, S. 1879, the Child Abuse Reporting Enforcement Act. And in this bill, it denies states eligibility for any payment from the Social Services Block Grant if HHS determines a state has failed to enact a law making a felony for individuals to fail to report child abuse cases to law enforcement or child protective agencies. And the state law must make it a felony with a minimum penalty of 1 year imprisonment for any person who had reasonable cause to believe a child was subject to abuse and failed to report such information immediately to law enforcement. In terms of what's next federally, none of these bills have moved yet. I think that Congress is in a wait-and-see approach. And the current focus more in Congress right now is, in any case, federal budget and appropriations activity. However, when the Sandusky trial begins, we anticipate a renewed federal focus. And we expect that there will be efforts inside of both budget and appropriations legislation to enact some kind of federal statement, perhaps a preemption, as it relates to mandatory reporting. And I look forward to answering your questions at that, and when we get to the end of the webinar. I'd like to turn now to Vicki Wilkins, the counsel on for the Committee on Senate Aging and Youth in Pennsylvania.
Excuse me. Hello. I'm counsel to the Senate Aging and Youth Committee, and prior to the whole Penn State child abuse issue breaking, Senate Aging and Youth last year held 2 hearings in the fall because we knew that we needed changes to our child abuse definition and also to how we process and some of our practices in the state. So last August, we held a hearing on the definition of child abuse. The participating entities were people that really have to do with the definition of child abuse: our District Attorneys Association, the Pennsylvania Children and Youth Solicitors Association, Allegheny County Human Services, the Protect Our Children Committee, the National Association of Social Workers, and the Pennsylvania Family Support Alliance. They all gave us a lot of good ideas on changes to Pennsylvania's definition of child abuse. And later in the program, when I give you the task force's website, all of the materials from that public hearing are there that you can view. Our hearing in October was at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, and we focused more on the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare, how they saw child abuse determined, what made it a case for child abuse that they would go and investigate. In Pennsylvania, one of the places where mandated reporters must call is an 800 number called Childline. It's housed in the Department of Public Welfare. It's a 24/7 hotline. There are workers there that take the information from anyone. It doesn't have to be a mandated reporter. Anyone witnessing child abuse or potential child abuse in Pennsylvania can call that number. They do an intake form, and then they send it out to the county. We also had some of the doctors from Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. There's a child advocacy center there. They spoke on physicians' frustrations with our definition of child abuse. And in particular, one of the areas the task force will be examining is Pennsylvania in our definition of serious bodily injury. A physician or someone must make a determination on whether it was severe pain, which from person to person, child to child, that's very hard to substantiate. So that's one of the issues that Pennsylvania with the task force is going to look at. We also had others from the American Academy of Pediatrics and Pittsburgh Mercy Health System also talk about physicians' frustrations with child abuse, and that video will also be on the task force website for your viewing. Senator Ward, my boss, she introduced, after Penn State, after all of that broke, and there were so many members that wanted to do something, as I said, we knew we needed to do something to update some of our laws. She introduced Senate Resolution 250, which established the Task Force on Child Protection. Governor Corbett had signed it shortly after it was enacted by both chambers, the House and the Senate. And the task force was charged with the following powers. They are to examine and analyze practices, processes, and procedures relating to the response to child abuse. They're to review and analyze all of our laws, procedures, practices, and rules relating to child abuse. They're to hold public hearings for the taking of testimony and requesting documents. Then they have until November 30th of this year. They need to make a report to the governor, the Senate, and the House and include recommendations to improve the reporting of child abuse, implement any necessary changes in state statutes and practices relating to child abuse, and make recommendations relating to training appropriate individuals in the mandating of in the reporting of child abuse, including mandated reporters, but even broader than that. I know one of the goals that Chairman Dave Heckler from Bucks County, he would like to do a complete rewrite of all of Pennsylvania's Child Protective Services laws. Pennsylvania, we are somewhat unique. We have a two-tiered system with general protective services and then a higher standard of our service of our child abuse. So that's another thing we're going to look at a public hearing coming up for the task force. The task force was made up of 4 gubernatorial appointments. David Heckler, he's our chair. He was a former state senator who did a significant rewrite on the Child Protective Services law when he was here as a senator. He's also been he's currently a district attorney, and he's been a Pennsylvania judge. So he is leading the task force and has a good perspective as a DA, judge, and legislator on what needs to be changed. William Strickland is also on the task force on behalf of the governor. Dr. Cindy Christian, she's at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, and Delilah Rumberg, who represents the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. The Senate appointed Dr. Rachel Berger from Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, and she's the assistant director of the CAC there. Garrison Ipock, who's the executive director to Glen Mills School, and Carol Hobb-Piccaccio, who's an intake social worker in Philadelphia. The House appointed Jason Koudalakis. He's an attorney, and he used to represent the Pennsylvania Children and Youth Solicitors Association. We also have an assistant district attorney from Blair County, Jackie Bernard, and Honorable Arthur Grimm. He's a senior judge from Berks County, and then he was on the Common Pleas Court there. The task force has met several times, January 16th and March 8th. Also on the website are the videos of those meetings. The website is www.childprotection.state.pa.us, and I'll make sure that NCSL has that with the materials, so you can view that. We update it after every meeting with the videos and materials, so that way everyone can clearly see what we're doing in Pennsylvania relating to the task force. We have a meeting in Philadelphia this Wednesday, again, focusing on the definition of child abuse. There'll be a meeting May 3rd in Harrisburg looking at our General Protective Services and Child Protective Services in the Juvenile Act. Another meeting in Harrisburg on May 14th, the response to child abuse, looking at how law enforcement responds, CACs and multidisciplinary teams. Then May 31st in Pittsburgh at Children's Hospital, we are going to be focusing on mandated reporters and training of mandated reporters. We're going to look at the entire scope of mandated reporters, K through 12, higher ed, all the licensed professionals that are mandated reporters, doctors, psychologists, nurses. And then we're going to hear from some of the people in Pennsylvania that currently do the training. So that should be interesting. We would welcome everyone to attend if you're somewhere near Pennsylvania. Like I said, all of that will be on the website. There are a couple bills that my boss has introduced. Senate Bill 1413, it increases the penalties for failure to report child abuse from a misdemeanor to felonies. And she also has introduced another Senate bill that would require that all employees that work at an institution of higher education are considered mandated reporters, and not only would you report to the head of your institution, but you would also call that 800 child line number that I mentioned earlier. That way, there's no likelihood of keeping the report of abuse in-house. It's going to go out to an impartial operator who will dispatch that to the county. And another bill of particular interest was Senate Bill 449, Senator Vance's bill, which we moved out of the Senate Aging and Youth Committee. It's a bill that trains school employees. It would require school districts to have all their school employees trained on child abuse. Every 3 years, they would have 5 hours of training. So Childline reports that the majority of their calls come from school employees who either don't know exactly what child abuse is, so this would clear up a lot of those issues. I look forward to your questions, and now I would like to turn the program over to Senator Foster.
Thank you very much, Vicki. I look forward to at least elaborating what's happened in our state. We are unlike Pennsylvania, a part-time legislature, so we have not had the luxury of the systematic process, deliberative process that they've had in looking at our legislation, which actually was enacted at the end of our 60-day session, which began in mid-January and ended in mid-March. But the process was really initiated last fall, shortly after the Penn State publicity, and some of the legislators clearly noted this, but we were actually stimulated by an op-ed, the Charleston paper, from a political science professor from West Virginia Wesleyan College, who subsequently communicated with me and indicated what he felt was the importance of dealing with this in our short session. He got the assistance of one of his classes who helped with analysis of what was going on around the country, and using one of my legislative analysts, we also looked at the legislation in multiple states. With the professor's help and his class's help, we introduced a bill similar to Delaware's legislation, which included mandated reporting for all non-minors. The overall goal, as this process worked through our legislature, and clearly there were changes, and I will try to detail the process and also give you some of the specifics of the enacted legislation. Our overall goal was to look at Joe Paterno's situation and the fact that he didn't have any legal requirement to report, and try to determine a way in which, if he had been in that situation, that our legislation would have required some level of reporting from him. As I mentioned, our initial legislation, which was entitled SB 161, was introduced in mid-January to our legislature, and there were some initial concerns from our Department of Health and Human Resources regarding the fear of over-reporting with a mandate for all, and could conceivably overwhelm their capacity. And for that reason, early on in the process, we looked at bifurcating the legislation that would include one aspect would be for those with traditional child abuse and neglect. The other would be specifically sexual abuse. And we were going to look at our list, which has existed in code for mandated reporting by numerous entities, including health professionals, religious healers, school teachers, social service workers, etc., and at least adding to that for all types of child abuse, coaches, both volunteer and paid, as well as camp counselors. And so that was part of the legislation that dealt with non-sexual abuse. And within that, there was a 48-hour time to report to our Department of Health and Human Resources. And in addition to observation, there would be reasonable cause to suspect as an additional reason for mandated reporting for that list of reportees. And if there was serious physical abuse, I'm not sure exactly how that would be determined, but that's the verbiage in the legislation that they must report to the state police or law enforcement. Regarding the other part of the bifurcation, sexual abuse, all non-minors are required. And there, again, it's the idea of observation or receiving disclosure from a credible witness, which was an issue in question about how you would determine whether someone actually got reasonable information about the act. And so that's how it was phrased: observation or receive disclosure from a credible witness. And they have 48 hours to report to either our Department of Health and Human Resources, state police, or other law enforcement that had jurisdiction over the entity. And there also was a concern regarding those individuals who, if they're mandated to report, that conceivably they could put either the child in question, themselves, or their own children in jeopardy. And if there was a good faith belief that would expose those individuals to potential harm, then they could delay the reporting until such time as that threat passes. And that was certainly an issue in question. And also, there was the question of lawyer-client privilege and how that should be handled. And we specifically excluded lawyers from reporting in that particular situation in our legislation. There was clearly nothing intended to prevent self-reporting of individuals, but there was not any provision related to immunity for reporting. The penalties in our previous code were misdemeanors, no greater than 10 days and no more than $100. And we increased both of those, but kept it as a misdemeanor up to 30 days and no more than $1,000. We also worked with our domestic violence and child advocacy groups, and they felt it was very important to at least have a provision related to educational programs that the State Department. This was subject to appropriation. We did not include the required appropriation, but said subject to appropriation in the budget bill. The State Department of Children's Needs would conduct educational and training programs for persons required to report subjected abuse and neglect, and also the general public, so that they would understand the differences in type of such behavior, and to assure that as much as possible that appropriate information would be transmitted to the authorities rather than inappropriate reports. The importance of all this fear of over-reporting, in our view, which was a balance between that and doing our best to protect children, was one aspect that was part of the discussion throughout the 45 to 50 days of discussion of this legislation. We feel we ended up with an adequate balance, and we got support in the end from the child advocacy groups and the domestic violence people and law enforcement. And fortunately, the Governor Tomlin signed our bill about 10 days ago, and at that time, the professor and his class from Washington Wesleyan came down to participate in the bill signing, which we thought was appropriate given their direct help with this legislation during the entire process. Look forward to further questions as we go on, and I will now turn it over to Gene.
Okay, thank you, Senator Foster, and to our other panelists for that great insight on this issue. One of the questions that we had come in is whether or not this PowerPoint will be made available to webinar participants, and the answer is yes. Every webinar that we hold in the NCSL University series is being recorded and will be archived, and you'll be made aware when it is available. Usually it takes 2 or 3 days to turn that around, but it will be available very soon. So we do have a number of good questions that have come in. Again, I want to remind everyone, if you have questions you'd like to ask our panelists, please use that chat box in the lower right part of your screen, and we will get to as many of these as we possibly can. Let's start off with one here that I will direct to Kelly. The question is, what about clergy as mandated reporters? How many states are affected by this?
We know that as of April 2010, there's 26 states that have in statutes that clergy are required as mandated reporters. In this session, Georgia introduced a bill, House Bill 1176, that specifically mentions clergy. In their House Bill 1176, they state that clergy are not required as mandated reporters if they learn about the suspected abuse in privileged communication through confession. However, if they hear that information or learn of that information outside of their role through confession, that they must comply with the mandatory reporting laws.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. And then kind of a related question that Senator Foster will toss your way. So Senator Foster raised an interesting matter. Some states accept legally privileged communications, such as clergy privilege, attorney-client privilege, in their mandatory reporting laws or legislation. Can you speak about what the advantages or disadvantages of that are? Senator Foster?
Yes. We clearly, both in our traditional sexual abuse and traditional child abuse and neglect and the sexual abuse, have included religious healers or clergy as being mandated. They are in the list that previously existed, and of course, when all are mandated, they are included. The attorney-client privilege, though, was one that we had discussions with the Judiciary Committee Council, and it was felt that that would be difficult to circumvent, given the nature of that privilege and the importance of that particular situation. But I'm sure there are others who may feel otherwise if in an egregious situation. But that was what we elected to do, given the politics of the situation.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Another question has come in. State caseworkers are not mandatory reporters in Montana. Is that the case in other states too? Kelly, can you address that?
Sure. And most states do spell out that social workers are mandated reporters, and there are not many. I actually am not sure of any states that clearly spell out, other than Montana, that caseworkers are not mandated reporters. So I apologize that I can't answer that better, but a number of states do require social workers as mandated reporters. And we can look it up and provide that information to you directly if we, offline, if that's possible.
Thank you, Kelly. A question for Vicki in Pennsylvania. What has been the public reaction to the task force being created there? Are people satisfied that this is addressing the issue out there?
So far, I believe that that's the case, and I know that both chambers, the House and the Senate, we have members that have introduced pieces of legislation, including my boss, and we're trying to get everyone to sit tight, and we're going to address these issues in a more global manner, since everything is related together: the definition, the mandated reporters, what kind of training, if we're going to change our system. So I think we've had a good response to people feeling, especially because the task force has such credible people on there that actually do work with child abuse every day. I think everyone's hoping that the task force will provide recommendations that will quickly implement. And the task force also has, they don't have to wait until November 30th to come up with the recommendations. The resolution provides them the ability to provide the General Assembly with periodic reports. So we're hoping after the summer, we'll come back into our session in September, and they'll have some legislative recommendations that we can do this fall.
Thank you, Vicki. Next question is, 18 states have universal mandated reporting, but the data on child abuse reporting or substantiation doesn't seem to differ between states with and without the universal requirement. Any comment on what impact it could have if states were to move to universal mandated reporting?
Sure. Your statement is correct that there is no data on the difference between states that require all folks to report and others that don't. So there is no really good data out there. What we do know is that numbers of reports called in do increase when a new 1-800 hotline number is implemented. When there's a child fatality in the state, you see numbers sometimes go up on mandatory reporters. Things like that, or a new statute is in place, you sometimes see the numbers go up. But other than that, there really is no data on the difference between it.
Okay. Thank you. And Sherry, we're going to toss this next one to you. It says, can NCSL restate their positions on this issue?
Absolutely. In the meeting in Tampa, Florida, as part of the issue of child welfare and family services, NCSL took the following position. And I'll read it to you because I think that's easiest. Child abuse and neglect cases can be complicated and involve the Child Protective Services, criminal justice, education, and court systems, among others. In our state-federal partnership to combat child abuse and neglect, NCSL encourages the federal government to support states in training mandatory reporters. NCSL opposes federal preemption in defining who is a mandatory reporter or unfunded federal mandates to combat the tragedy of child abuse and neglect. That would be NCSL's position. As we look at these bills, what we have been doing is offering technical assistance, guidelines, guidance, and also a lot of information on what you are doing out in the states, because state legislators have spent time really thinking through, and you can hear it with the two state examples, some of the implications and making different policy choices based on the unique conditions inside of their states. And so we've encouraged our congressional partners to really take a deeper look here and really understand better what's going on in the states, that state legislators are examining the issue of mandatory reporting, and perhaps federal preemption is not warranted.
Thank you, Sherry. Our next question is, how many states require mental health professionals, such as psychologists or psychiatrists, to report child abuse? Kelly?
We do know that there's a number of states that have been listed as mandatory reporters. The exact number I can get you offline and kind of go through the statutes and find out what states do require that and send that to you, if that's helpful, Michael.
Okay. Thank you. And then, Vicki, we have a question about in Pennsylvania, have there been issues of employees being dismissed for reporting child abuse? If so, were they mandated reporters, or was it a matter of sharing privileged information?
That's a good question. I don't know specifically about employees being fired. However, we hear a lot from psychologists who are mandated reporters in Pennsylvania. They do the mandatory reporting, and then one of the parents who was accused of the child abuse has sued them, and then there's been disciplinary action at their licensing board. So at our May 31st hearing in Pittsburgh, talking about mandated reporters, we are going to ask the prosecuting attorneys and some psychologists to particularly focus on this issue.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vicki. Our next question is, what general trends do you see or anticipate in creating and disseminating new training programs? And I think we'll start here with Kelly, and then if Senator Foster or Vicki want to jump in on their observations, we'd like that as well. Kelly?
What we do know is that in this session there's been 14 bills that have introduced something around new training, new education for mandated reporters or education systems. And I'd imagine that there'd probably be more bills out there, or more offline, kind of, not through statute, but more training and more education in states around this issue.
Vicki or Senator Foster, do you have any observations from your perspective?
I will comment. We certainly had a long discussion of this as our bill moved through the legislature from the child advocacy individuals, and who were adamant about at least strong consideration of these training programs, both for the mandated reporters as well as for the general public, particularly since we had for sexual abuse, all were going to be required. And there was an individual who came from Massachusetts, from the National Child Advocacy Group, who provided some information regarding the depth and breadth of education that would be required. It does require resources, and that's the issue that kept us from actually including that mandate in our legislation. But the hope is that as time unfolds and this issue becomes even more visible with the trial of the Penn State individual, that this will be considered more strongly, given our financial situation in our state.
Okay, thank you, Senator Foster. Our next question is, have you seen any success with legislation that includes sanctions from licensing boards for mandated reporters? Have they been receptive to increasing training? Kelly?
I would answer that we did see this session, there's one bill, and I'm sorry, I don't know the state or the bill number, but we'll find it for you. One bill that does specifically mention licensing boards as becoming mandated reporters. And have they been receptive to increasing trainings? I'm not sure, but I would throw that back out to West Virginia or Pennsylvania to see if you've had any experience around licensing boards being mandated reporters or increasing trainings for them.
I can speak from my standpoint, particularly as a physician. It's an area of concern, but it has not been discussed within our state about the role of the licensing boards in education for its individuals. And I can't speak to the other licensing boards that might be considered, but it certainly is a good point, and one that we may have to look into as our legislation evolves.
Okay. Senator Foster, another question for you. What has been the response of law enforcement agencies, state agencies, advocacy groups, and those types with the passage of your legislation there in West Virginia?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the child advocacy and domestic violence groups, and as well as the Department of Health and Human Resources, the state agency, were all involved as this was nuanced through the process. We had to deal with there's particular issues. DHHR was concerned about over-reporting, as was to a certain extent the domestic violence individuals. But when we came together for consensus, as our legislation went through the Senate and then the House, we got support from those groups in their entirety, and we didn't hear anything negative from law enforcement or the prosecutors regarding enforcement, and so I felt that we got during the process and thus far have continued to get support from all the entities that you mentioned.
Thank you. Well, I think what we will do now is, as we approach the end of our hour here, I'll ask all the panelists for some final round of comments, and then we will close this out. So let's start with Kelly, and then we'll go to Sherry, Vicki, and then Senator Foster. Kelly?
First, I wanted to just go back to that licensing board question. I found the bill. It's Pennsylvania House Bill 2026, where they actually specifically require licensing boards for professionals as mandated reporters. And as a quick wrap-up, we're continuing to track this we're continuing to track this legislation, and we'll keep it updated on our website as things move from pending to enacted, and as states maybe introduce new bills. We will continue to track this and be on top of it as we can. Thank you.
Sherry?
What I would say is that NCSL staff in the Washington office will continue to track and analyze federal legislation, particularly looking at its impacts on state and state legislative authority, funding, and also state bills in general. We will be reporting on the movement of bills as we go forward through the Human Services Listserv and to the Human Services Committee. We also will be posting an analysis of the pending bills, the 9 pending bills so far. And we really welcome questions, if there are questions about some of the implications of some of these federal law and policy change proposals.
Thank you, Sherry. Vicki, some final thoughts?
I would just say that we're going to be very busy here in Pennsylvania with our task force in the next couple months with our 4 or 5 hearings, and then taking that information, trying to determine statutorily what needs to be changed, and then in the fall, legislature will be busy trying to get those changes made.
Okay, thank you. And Senator Foster.
Yes, we will continue to look at potential unintended consequences from what we have enacted in the hopes that we will see few of those. And clearly, this is a situation that, is about the children. We were overwhelmed by what happened up at Penn State, and apart from the enforcement provisions, the increased visibility of this problem in our state and in our country is one that we hope will make it much more likely that our children will be able to grow up in a protected way.
Thank you, Senator. And I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Thanks to our panelists for providing us this unique perspective today. And thank you all of you for attending and for submitting your questions. Again, if you want more information on these issues, please note the resources listed on the screen. Kelly and Sherry are more than happy to take your questions or provide insights on what is happening at the state and federal level. And as a member of NCSL, we encourage you to take advantage of their expertise. As a reminder, this presentation is being recorded, and an archive will be available in a few days at www.ncSL.org/NCSLU. Plan on joining us on April 27th for a webinar on state social media policies, and on May 11th when Dr. David Landis discusses effective negotiation. So on behalf of the National Conference of State Legislatures, this is Gene Rose. We look forward to having you with us at a future webinar. Thank you.